portion of our Promoting Independence and Access Through Responsible Design. And before I turn things over to our speaker today, just want to give a word about Melissa Anderson, our presenter. Melissa is a professional engineer specializing in pedestrian safety and access for people with disabilities. She was the transportation engineer for the U.S. Access Board and worked to develop the most recent version of the proposed Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. Melissa currently owns her own company, providing pedestrian accessibility training across the country and assisting state and local agencies in assessing and writing policies and updating transition plans. She also serves as a third-party consultant when clients find themselves facing compliance reviews or other enforcement actions. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the session over to Melissa.
Thank you, Nancy. Next slide. Slide 15. So we've been talking about how to promote independence in our public right-of-way, and we've made it through sidewalk basics, and we've talked about obligations at each webinar. We talked about intersections and what we find off the curb that also requires access. And today we're going to talk more about policies and things you can do to incorporate basically a culture of promoting access within your organization. Next slide. So part 4, I snuck an extra section in here, and I added disability awareness. I've been working with several clients lately, and they all have noted that people understand how to accommodate people better if they have a general understanding of disabilities. And so I'm going to touch on this in a really high-level way. And then we're going to talk about Title II responsibilities again, some access awareness in planning, and then in design, and how can we make our construction accessible and results in accessible facilities. And what about the rest of our operations, our maintenance, our permits, just the daily grind, the things that happen every day, even when we're not working on projects. Slide 17. So we're going to start with disability awareness. Slide 18. So in putting this together, I actually found myself going back to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we talk about it a lot, but sometimes we really just need to go back and take a look at it and read through parts of it. And you can find that on DOJ's website, which is www.ada.gov, under their regulations. And one of the first things you'll see is why do we have the Americans with Disabilities Act? And it says that Congress finds that in enacting the ADA, Congress recognized that physical and mental disabilities in no way diminish a person's right to fully participate in all aspects of society. But because people with physical and mental disabilities are frequently precluded from doing so, because of prejudiced and antiquated attitudes and failure to remove societal and institutional barriers. So that's why we've enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act, or Congress did. Slide 19. So when we talk about disability with respect to an individual, what does that really mean? So a person who has a disability has a physical or mental impairment that substantially impairs one or more major life activities. Or it could be a person who has a record of such impairment. So a person may have multiple sclerosis and it might be in remission, but in the past they did have a disability, and so they're still considered to have a disability. And it also includes people who are simply regarded as having such an impairment, even if they don't actually have one. And the definition of disability is meant to be broadly interpreted. Slide 20. So we need broad coverage in that definition. So if you're in doubt, whether or not to consider someone a person with a disability who needs an accommodation, you need to lean towards making that accommodation. And just from a really general high level point of view, what are the things that we can do to take that stand? And as we're doing designs, thinking about things like universal design concepts, where the whole design structure is based around everyone being able to use a system or a facility, is a good place to start. And probably the most important thing is that we stop building barriers and when we're doing our construction and alterations and when we develop our policies. Slide 21. So how many people are we really talking about? I've done training before, and more than once I've had people in the audience raise their hand and say, why do I have to do this? We don't have those people in our community. Well, you don't see some of these people in your community because they're trapped in their homes. Their sidewalks don't have curb ramps, or they have big heaves in them, or when they come to a city meeting they can't hear what's going on and there are no interpreters. So there are a lot of people in the United States that have disabilities. In fact, there's 61 million adults in the United States who have disabilities. And it amounts to being 26% of the adults. And this information comes from the Center for Disease Control. And if you look on their website, you can find statistics specific for each state. And they have a lot of really interesting disability statistics on their website. Slide 22. So what kind of disabilities are we talking about? So there are a lot of different kinds, and they're categorized. Mobility is one of the biggest issues. And of course, when we're talking about transportation, we're talking about mobility. And a person with a mobility disability has trouble walking or climbing stairs. There are also a lot of people who have cognitive disabilities that can affect how they make decisions as they're traveling. The other ones that we're going to talk about a little bit more are hearing and vision. And they make up a small percentage of adults with the disability types, but they're significant. Slide 23. So let's start with mobility disabilities. And I borrowed some of this information from my good friend Jim DeYoung, and he had this icon, which is in the bottom right, and it's a picture of a man in a wheelchair who has ropes all around him. And it's one of the things that bothers people sometimes is the etiquette and the terms that people use. A person with a mobility disability, it may simply be somebody who has trouble walking or walking long distances or climbing stairs. And they may use a wheelchair or a walker or a cane, or they may just have a shuffling gait and get easily fatigued, or may have balance problems. But we talk about using people-first language, and that's important when we talk about people who have disabilities, not disabled people. And it's just a polite way of being respectful. We don't say a person is wheelchair-bound or confined to a wheelchair. So this image up here, I want you guys to kind of keep that in your head, because I see this in newspaper articles quite a bit, and it's kind of disheartening. And we're not building handicap ramps, we're simply building curb ramps, and the curb ramps are there for everyone. So another point of etiquette is that a person's wheelchair is how they get around. It's like their legs. And so you don't lean on or touch a person's wheelchair. And when possible, if a person is sitting because they're tired, or if they're using a wheelchair, sit down for a conversation. It makes it more comfortable for everyone. And always ask before you try to help someone. So if you see a person who's struggling with a door, don't just rush in and swing the door open for them. They may very well be using that door for balance. And it's always important to ask before you help, and be respectful if you're turned down in your offer. Slide number 24. So when we think about mobility disabilities, what can we do to make things easier? So we've talked about using the ADA standards for curb ramps and the proposed public right-of-way guidelines and the fact that we have a lot of flexibility in how we design our infrastructure. So first we have to use standards and policies that promote access. And we also need to consider exceeding the minimum requirements. So the Access Board has determined what are the minimum requirements so that people can get around. Well, if you just build to the minimum, you're still going to leave a few people out. So always try to make things as accessible as possible. And some of the best practices you can use in design are to minimize the length of the path of travel. Don't send somebody around three crosswalks at an intersection just because you don't want to have to build a compliant curb ramp on the fourth leg of the intersection. Make sure the routes are clear and continuous. You can see in the picture on the bottom left that it's one that we used before when we talked about continuous clear width. It's easy to follow, it's direct, there's a clear path that's not cluttered. Think about reach ranges. When you're designing something that a person has to operate, think about the operable parts requirements and design for a person who's seated. So it might be how you permit bank machines on your right-of-way, your parking meters and pay stations, and make sure you have enough travel time for people who may cross the street more slowly. And as transportation engineers, a lot of times we kind of get in a rut and we want to move cars, we want to move vehicles. And granted, that's a very important thing to do on our arterial systems, during rush hour. But we need to accommodate pedestrians, and there are devices that make that easier to accommodate both modes, like extended press push buttons. So make sure you take those things into consideration when you are working on your designs. Slide 25. So I also mentioned cognitive disabilities. So a person who has a cognitive disability may have trouble concentrating or making decisions. And they might ask for you to repeat things over and over. And I know that just as I get older, sometimes I have to say, wait, what did you say again? Sometimes my mind wanders, and sometimes I didn't listen clearly. But some people have trouble really putting the thoughts together in a sequence that makes sense. And you might find that a person needs to take a lot of notes or ask for the information again. So etiquette that we can use when assisting people who have cognitive disabilities or have trouble remembering or making decisions is, first of all, don't make assumptions about what they can and can't do. You don't know for sure, and you can't really assume that a person, you might assume they can't hear you if they're not understanding, and that probably isn't the case. You need to explain things clearly and repeat if asked. So make things simple and clear and concise, and make sure that you're willing to write information down so that once a person walks out of your door or continues down the street, they'll understand, they can look at that information and remember again what they were supposed to do. And keep it simple. Simplify and summarize. And most of all, be patient. So patience is tough sometimes. I know I'm guilty of trying to finish people's sentences for them all the time. But you have to be patient. Let people talk, listen to what they have to say, and respond in the appropriate manner. Slide number 26. So how do we design for clear understanding? I think it was probably junior high when one of my teachers forced us to remember this phrase of KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. We don't need to make things complicated all the time. And in designing to make things clear and simple, we can think back to the picture a couple slides ago of the sidewalk that had all of the tables and chairs moved away from the storefront and you had a clear path. But here you can see a picture on the top right of side storefront and a sidewalk, and it's got bike racks and bicycles and planters and utility poles and tree grates. And yes, you can get through there, and you know you need to get to the other end of the corner. But for somebody who has a high level of anxiety or a cognitive disability, it can be difficult for them to, it's just more sensory overload. And to think about maneuvering down that sidewalk, we do that kind of unconsciously, but it does add, anxiety if you have to figure out how you're going to do it. We need simple messaging. When we do signage, icons and graphics are simple for everyone, and super important to be consistent. So if we look at the signs that are along the bottom of the slide, we have a icon of a pedestrian with a prohibitive circle around them and a cross through the pedestrian. It's pretty clear what that means. No pedestrians. And if you compare the two signs to the right, there's a push button for a walk with an arrow pointing to the appropriate street crossing versus another MUTCD approved sign that says start crossing, watch for vehicles, don't start, finish crossing, if started, time remaining to finish crossing, don't cross, push button to cross, Maple Drive. That's a lot. That's a lot to think about, and you don't want to miss something important if you're worried about getting across the street. And keeping it simple in our signage is not only benefits people with cognitive disabilities, but children who may not be old enough to read yet, which they probably shouldn't be out running around by themselves. But kids that are out, you can take a quick look at an icon and know what it means without having to read a whole sign. It also benefits people who are non-English speaking. So they could be tourists and trying to get around a big city like Washington, D.C. Slide number 27. So an important part of our responsibilities as Title II agencies or consultants that serve them is effective communication. And this is kind of a paraphrased version of what's in the ADA, but it says that a public entity is required to take appropriate steps to ensure that communication with people who have disabilities is as effective as communication with everybody else. And it also says that a public entity has to furnish appropriate auxiliary aids and services in order to make that happen. So, slide 28. So we're going to talk about hearing disabilities with the effective communication in mind. So a person who has a hearing disability may be completely deaf, or they may be hard of hearing, or just have a slight hearing loss. Some people use sign language, some people read lips, some people will use gestures with their friends that don't mean anything to anyone else. And so how do we behave around people with a hearing loss? If you have someone who has an interpreter, you speak directly to the person who is deaf and not to the person who is interpreting. And the person who is deaf is going to be looking at the interpreter and not looking back at you. So sometimes it feels uncomfortable, but it's important to treat that person with the respect that they deserve and always look at the person that you're speaking to. Speak clearly, don't cover your mouth, and that's important for people who are hard of hearing. And as our population grows older, I don't generally speak very loudly, and I find myself with some of my friends, they don't hear well, and I have to actually make sure to make a conscious effort to turn to face them and speak clearly. So look at people so that they can watch what you're saying. And make sure that if you have public meetings, they're in a well-lit room so interpreters can be seen, so that people can read your lips or follow along more easily. And also be willing to write notes or text. I have a friend who is deaf that I don't see very often, and I've not yet learned sign language. I probably should. But texting has made things so much easier because we just grab our phones and then we can text back and forth. But you can also just use gestures and body language. And don't be embarrassed. They've probably seen an amazing amount of things as people try to communicate with them. And number one, don't shout. So talking loudly to a person who is profoundly deaf just makes a lot of noise and doesn't really get your point across. Slide number 29. So we hear a lot about video relay services, which is another way to help accommodate people who have hearing loss. And this is another slide I borrowed from my friend Jim. And it's a good illustration of how the video relay services work. So I thought that I would share it with you. So a person who is deaf signs to an interpreter using a camera. It could be on their computer, it could be on their desktop or their kitchen counter. And then the interpreter can tell what they've said and can speak to a person on a phone in another location. And as that hearing person responds to the interpreter, she is then able to interpret for the person who is using the video relay services. So it's a good system that we have, and our technology has come up with a lot of amazing ways to make things better for people with hearing loss. Slide number 30. So when we try to accommodate hearing loss, there's a requirement, and this is more in the building standards, that in an assembly area, if you're using a microphone or an amplification device, you're required to have assistive listening devices available. So this means when you're having a public meeting, or if you're having a city council meeting, or if you are leading a tour down the sidewalk with microphones, you're required to have assistive listening devices. And if you look in the scoping in Section 219 of the 2010 ADA standards, it'll give you some specific guidance and talk about the different devices. The Access Board also has a good amount of research available on their website about assistive listening devices. It's somewhat dated, but it still helps get some of the basic concepts through. So when you have public meetings, we talked about consider the room lighting, make sure people can see each other clearly, make sure that you have captioners and interpreters under contract. So if you have a person who has a need, you don't have to start scanning the internet trying to find somebody who might be available or might provide the service you want. Get policies set up so you know who to call when you need them. If you are city management, you need to think about your police department and your fire department. How are they going to deal with people who have disabilities? And not so much transportation related, but just in your whole Title II operations. And if you put videos out on your websites, or if you show videos for a project, they need to be captioned. And if you are going to have a meeting, let people know that they can get material ahead of time. A lot of times when we do presentations, we have to turn in presentations early for alternative formats to be created for people who have requested them. So you also need to know, how are you going to accomplish that? Do you have a printer who knows how to create large print documents? Are they accessible on a screen reader? Do you need to have something put in Braille? And you also need to be able to work with people and explain things and make sure they can understand what's going on. And one of the best technologies that's come out are looped audio systems. And a looped audio system is basically a wire you put under the carpet in a room where you have a microphone system. And it works with many hearing aids. So some pharmacies have actually started putting loops around their pharmacy service areas so that a person with a hearing aid, there's a special symbol with a little T that stands for the T-coil that's in a lot of hearing aids. If a person has a T-coil in their hearing aid, which is really common, and they see this sign, they know that they can hear a person clearly and directly by using this loop system. And Museums have started doing this. I know the conference rooms at the Access Board are set up with the looped audio system. There are a lot of options out there, but I've always been really impressed with the loop system. Slide 31. What about speech disabilities? We think about people who don't hear or don't see, but some people have a disadvantage when they try to speak. They may not be able to speak at all, or they may have trouble speaking clearly. And sometimes it's so extreme that a person needs a computer or a tablet to communicate. And if we think about etiquette for a person with speech disability, don't pretend to understand what they said. If you can't understand, ask them to repeat it. I have a friend who has cerebral palsy, and he's an incredibly bright person, and he has so much to contribute to a conversation. And it really takes some effort to stop and wait for him to finish sentences and to listen closely to hear what he has to say, because he really does have a lot to contribute. But you also have to be willing to write notes, text back and forth, just like for someone who may be hearing impaired. And if a person uses a computer to talk, there's a little girl in the picture on the bottom right who has a wheelchair and a computer device set up, and there's a picture of her screen. Have a conversation with them. Don't think, oh, this is too weird, I'm out of here. It's important that you treat people with respect again. And Stephen Hawking was an incredibly intelligent person, and we all kind of know that he was dependent on a computer to portray what he had to say. And it's important not to raise your voice and shout, and mostly be patient. Slide number 32. So we talk a lot in transportation about vision impairments. So about 5% of people have a vision impairment, and they may have decreased vision or be completely blind. They could use a guide dog or a white cane. A lot of people with reduced vision don't have any assistive devices at all. And when we're working with people who may have a vision impairment, make sure that you have the resources available, like I mentioned, for large print, braille, or electronic formats. Be willing to read information or documents, and be willing to fill out forms. If somebody wants to call and file a complaint, but they're having trouble using your website, offer to fill out the forms for them. Somebody calls to make an ADA complaint, very politely fill out their forms for them. When you're in a group of people, and if somebody is blind or has vision impairment, make sure you introduce yourself and other people in the group. And before you speak, say your name if there's a chance that a person may not be familiar enough that they recognize your voice. And we do that a lot, when we do conference calls. This is Melissa, and this is what I have to say. But it's also good to orient a person towards their environment. So if a person asks for directions, get them situated with some landmarks, so that it might be a straight edge curb, it might be a texture of the pavement, but help people understand the environment that they're in. And again, just like a mobility disability, offer assistance, but wait for an individual's response and direction. So if somebody has asked for directions and you think, well, I could take you over to where the restrooms are, don't just grab an elbow and start dragging them toward the bathroom. Ask if they would like your assistance, and then offer an elbow, and they'll generally take it if they want the assistance very gently and let you walk to wherever you're going, and they'll follow along. Slide number 33. So here are some examples of what people see, and this is a slide that I borrowed from Janet Barlow. She works for Accessible Design for the Blind and is a national expert, and she's used these slides across the country. And it really helps you think about, when you're designing your intersections, how people can be impacted. So if you look at the top left-hand slide, you can see it's clear. There are two cars waiting while a person walks across the street in a crosswalk. There's traffic moving, going parallel to the crosswalk. You can see the detectable warnings. You can see the traffic signs. You can see the walk sign, although it's pretty far away. If you look at the next slide on the top right, you have the same picture. But this is an example of somebody that has a general acuity loss. So everything is a little bit fuzzy. For somebody who sees like this, it's difficult to pick out the individual elements. Are the cars moving? Are they not moving? What is going on with the street lights? Are they green? Are they red? Is the walk signal on? It's tough to see in these situations. The bottom left is a case of central vision loss. And central vision loss, this is an extreme example of what you would see if you had macular degeneration. So your central vision is just gone. So you have to piece together from what you see in the periphery what might be going on in the center of your vision. And it's obviously very difficult to do. When you look at the bottom right-hand picture, this is a restricted peripheral vision. And it's sometimes called tunnel vision. So you really have to try to point yourself towards what you're trying to focus on, but you lose the information of what's going on in the periphery. Are there cars coming to the left or to the right? You can look at the crossing signal, but you don't really know if it's safe to cross without that other visual information. Slide number 34. So when we talk about designing for vision loss, we need to think about the requirements for no protruding objects in circulation path. You need to use good pedestrian wayfinding and channelizing in work zones. One of the requirements in the public right-of-way guidelines is that you have a separation of your sidewalk from the circulatory roadway at a roundabout, and that's to help people find the actual street crossing. And also in the public right-of-way guidelines is the requirement for accessible pedestrian signals. Now, the last two, I put them in as requirements, but they're proposed guidelines from the public right-of-way. Accessible pedestrian signals are especially helpful for people who have vision loss when they try to cross the street. Best practices are to make sure that your sidewalks are clear. And for street crossing, really pay attention to your crosswalk and curb ramp alignment. If you can head people directly from the sidewalk to the crosswalk and have some vertical alignment to keep them going straight across the street, that can be really helpful. Try to avoid skewed crosswalks where you get to the center of the road where you have a median and then you suddenly send someone in a different direction. Diagonal curb ramps can be a problem, because if that's the only transition you have from the sidewalk to the street, a person has to reorient themselves once they get up or down that diagonal curb ramp. And be consistent. So if you have a community, it's hard to roll everything out at one time, but adjusting traffic signals to all be consistent is not too difficult. There are areas in the country that if you go from block to block, the information and the way it's portrayed in an accessible pedestrian signal is completely different. Some may talk, some may make percussive tones, and that's okay. But are they doing it during the walk signal? Are they doing it, what information are you getting that indicates the information you need to have? And that's what needs to be consistent. Slide 35. And just a little bit about service animals. Service animals for a long time they were a major source of lawsuits. And people with all types of disabilities use service animals. So if people come into your offices and they have a service animal, it's important that you accommodate them. Even if you have a no policy or a no animal policy. And I should have added a picture up here. Shortly after I started working for the Access Board, my daughter took a picture of a sign in a small city courthouse that said, no animals except people with disabilities. Everybody thought it was really pretty hilarious. So, yeah, think about your signs. But if you have a no animal policy, if the animal is a service animal, they should be accommodated. So some etiquette when you're around service animals is don't touch or distract a service animal because they're working. They're doing their job, paying attention to what their owner needs. And be accommodating and know where a service animal can be taken in a green space. I've noticed most of the airports now have relief areas for animals. When you encounter someone who has a service dog, you can't ask for a license or a training document. They're not required, and they don't tell you that it's a service animal or if it isn't. There's only 2 questions that you're allowed to ask. And one of them is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And you can't ask about that person's disability. And the second question is, what work or task have they been trained to perform for you? So those are the only 2 questions you can ask. If you start asking about a person's disability, you can run into a lot of trouble. And there's quite a bit of information on service animals in the Title II section of the Department of Justice's Technical Assistance webpage. So it would be a good thing to take a look at. Companion animals have started showing up. Companion animals and service animals are not the same thing. So an animal that just accompanies a person for comfort doesn't fall under the same requirements, and they don't necessarily have to be accommodated. But again, it's difficult to draw that line and figure out, is it a companion animal or is it a service animal? And it's best to read some of that information on the Department of Justice's website. Slide 36. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about Title II agency responsibilities. And I know I've tried to pound this into your head already for the last 3 sessions, but we're going to go through some of this. Talk about a few different things this time. Slide number 37. So Title II entities, which are state and local governments, are required to provide program access. The ADA is a civil rights law, not a building code. It prohibits discrimination in program services and activities. And so not everything has to be accessible. You just have to make sure that a person can fully utilize an activity or a program that your organization provides to their citizens. So when you build new construction, it is required to be accessible. When you do an alteration has to be accessible to the extent that's practicable. But it's the existing facilities where you can use the program access allowance if necessary. And if you need to make some accommodations that for an existing facility, you may be able to move someone to a different building, etc. And if your existing facilities are part of a program and they're not accessible, they probably should be on your transition plan. Slide number 38. So what is program access? It says that Title II requires their program services and activities, when viewed in their entirety, have to be readily accessible and usable by people with disabilities. So the focus isn't on facilities, but on the program. And when we talk about transportation, so an example of program access is, let's say you have a swimming club offered or a certain swimming class offered in your community, and not every pool in the city is accessible. So if a person is wanting to take that class, but the pool closest to them is not accessible, an accommodation to that, to provide access to that program, a city may have to make an accommodation by providing transportation to a different facility. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you can provide a service or an activity under program access. And I guess while we're talking about it, after the public right-of-way guidelines are published someday, Department of Transportation will be able to pick them up as standards much more quickly than the Department of Justice, because the Department of Justice will have a much higher burden of evaluating the financial impact on program access. So that's one of the things that will come out in the future. That's why it took them quite a bit longer to adopt the 2010 standards as opposed to the Department of Transportation's 2006 standards. So the focus is not on facilities. However, when you're dealing with the transportation system, it's hard to accommodate all those programs if you aren't making all of your facilities accessible. Slide 39. So you can't make transportation facilities partially accessible very easily. And you have to make infrastructure changes where they're needed. So you have to look at your system. If somebody requests a specific accommodation, even though you may not be able to make everything in their neighborhood accessible, that's where you can use program access to accommodate that individual person and try to help mitigate whatever needs they have. So if a person requests an accessible pedestrian signal at, say, 3 intersections so that they can get to work safely, you know, it's an accommodation, but it's a way of using program access. And then the rest of your intersections may be on your transition plan for accessible signals. There's also an undue burden allowance. And the thing about an undue burden, when you use it in Title III, you can say that, well, you know, building out everything to be accessible is an undue burden given our budget. But when you look at a city or a transportation agency, the undue burden would be evaluated against your full agency budget. So let's say you're a state DOT. That means your budget for transportation or for your roads, your bridges, your operations, all of those would be considered. And it's hard to say that upgrading your curb ramps would be an undue burden given the millions and millions of dollars that you have for your transportation program. So undue burden there is allowed, but nobody really pushes it for transportation facilities. Slide 40. So here's an example, something to think about. We don't really use the term path of travel when we talk about the public right-of-way, but pedestrian access routes are required to be accessible. How do you identify a path of travel that works for everyone? So this is a slide that we used when we talked about street crossings. If I don't want to put all of those curb ramps in, can I just create a path of travel to a business? Well, how do I know where that person is coming from? And what about the next person that comes along? And what if they want to go to the business across the street? So you can't just go and make one side of your street accessible and ignore the other side and say, well, that's program access. You can use the sidewalks on Main Street, because there's a whole lot of things that people have access to on the other side of the street. Or, you know, you may have a friend that lives down the street and only the other side is accessible. You've created a burden on that person by not allowing them to get where the rest of us could maybe go without those accessible features. Slide 41. And we have to think about, as we're working on our transportation facilities, the ADA is a civil rights law. So we have to, when we can't decide whether we're being unfair or not, we have to think about whether or not we're discriminating. So if I can use a facility, but my friends who use wheelchairs or walkers or who are blind can't use them, that's discrimination. So if you look at the picture on the left, there's a picture of a crosswalk that goes to a curb, and there's grass on the other side of the curb without a sidewalk, and then there's a pedestrian push button. So I can use that, but my friends who use wheelchairs can't get to that button to push it. So that's discrimination. If you don't want people to cross the road, you can't just not put a curb ramp in so that people who have a disability can't cross the road. You really have, if you're blocking a crosswalk for safety reasons, it's not safe for me to cross either. And so it needs to be clear that everyone is being treated the same. And it might be a really inconvenient or a bummer situation for me, but if everyone is being treated the same, it's not discrimination. And those are the things you have to think about. Just because it's a crummy situation, if it's crummy for everyone, that's okay. But if it's only crummy for people who have a disability, that's discriminating. Slide 42. So when you get a request for an accommodation, if you're a local agency or a state transportation agency, always be responsive. This is how lawsuits start. If a person asks for an accommodation and they are refused, or they get a bad attitude, or they're ignored, they have the opportunity to fill out a complaint form with your community, or with the state, with DOT, or with the Department of Justice. And filling out forms on the internet is super simple. So always make sure that you are proactive when you get a request for an accommodation. So what kinds of accommodations might we be asked for? And it might be for pedestrian signals. Somebody may need that accessible pedestrian signal so they can walk their kids to school, or so they can get to the grocery store, so they can get to work. Could be transit stops. So if someone requests an accommodation, it may be that they use four different transit stops on their way to work. So let's say they use 2, because 4 is a lot. Those transit stops may need to have certain accommodations. Maybe they need to have detectable warnings put in the curb ramp that goes near there, or maybe the boarding and alighting area isn't long enough for a person who uses a wheelchair. So an accommodation would be to work with that individual person and accommodate their requests. So if other elements of your facilities aren't accessible, it doesn't mean you never have to make them accessible because no one asked. It means they're on your transition plan so that other people won't have to ask in the future. But an important part of accommodating a request is having a budget for unplanned projects. So when someone asks for something to be fixed, let's say you've got sidewalks or curb ramps, someone calls and says, the sidewalk is all heaved by this tree and I can't get past it in my wheelchair, or the sidewalk is too narrow here, I almost ran off the edge. You need to have money set aside to accommodate those requests. It's not really a slush fund, but it's a budget for unplanned projects. Slide 43. And are there exceptions? And there really aren't. There is a thing called safe harbor. And somebody once said that the ADA was adopted, so it has no grandfather. So things are safe harbored, they are not grandfathered. So your existing facilities that were built before the ADA was in force are not grandfathered in. You have to meet your program access obligations. So a safe harbor means that if you built a facility that was fully compliant with the standard that's in effect at the time of construction, it has safe harbor. So let's say you were using the 1991 Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines, the 91 ADAG, and you put all diagonal curb ramps in. That was acceptable, and that's in effect at the time of construction, and actually it's still allowed in the 2010 standards. In the future, if the public right-of-way guidelines are adopted, Safe Harbor is part of a regulation. So this has been a part of the 2010 standards and other accessibility standards, but generally if a facility is fully compliant with another standard, they don't have to be altered in your transition plan, your ADA upgrades, to meet the newer standards. And where this comes into effect for a lot of people is when you do resurfacing, there was a time where detectable warnings were required, and then they weren't, and then they were again, detectable warnings on curb ramps. And so if you built a curb ramp during the time where detectable warnings weren't required, and you did not put them in there, when you do an alteration, if the rest of your curb ramp is compliant, you don't have to add detectable warnings. You may choose to do so because it's a good thing to do, but they would be safe harbored. And there's a really good description of that in the Federal Highway and the DOT and DOJ question and answer after the technical memo on resurfacing that we talked about. And and you can find that on Federal Highway's website, the Access Board website, or DOJ's website. So if you do an alteration, you will trigger compliance with a current standard or guideline. So if it was compliant, actually that's not true. So if it's compliant with an older standard, you don't have to do it as part of your transition plan. But once you alter it, then you do have to upgrade it to a current standard. There's another, not really exception, but an accommodation for not making accommodations. Qualified historic facilities. If a facility is on a state registry for historic facilities, and an alteration is going to impact the historical significance of that facility, you have to make it accessible to the extent that it doesn't. And a lot of times when you work with some of the historic preservation entities, they will work with you and compromise to find a solution that works for everybody. Because historic facilities, deserve to be seen by everyone, so everyone needs access to them. Sometimes you also have regulatory and physical constraints that keep you from making things fully accessible. Slide number 44. And one of the things in the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's in the Public Right-of-Way Guidelines, and it's in the 2010 standards, it's in the DOT requirements, is that you're allowed to use equivalent facilitation. And what that means is when you do a design, and you may choose to use a design that provides equal or better access than what's in the requirements. So it's going above the minimum or doing something different that provides the same level of access. So these are some of the things that are in the regulations that help you make your facilities accessible, but they're not so technical in nature. And if you use equivalent facilitation in your designs, that's great. There's no approval system in place. So if you decide that something is more accessible than a requirement, you can't go to the Department of Justice or the Access Board and get their approval that says, oh yeah, that is better. You've got to document your decision. Make sure you really weigh what was the minimum requirement, what you provided instead, and why is it better. And it has to be defensible in court. But don't be afraid to do it. Just document it. Slide number 45. So we're going to work through kind of work through the city systems. And we're going to start with planning and talk about access awareness when you're planning your projects. Slide number 46. So, organizational culture is a big deal. Sometimes we get a lot of friction when we try to make access a priority. And when you work in the field of accessibility, pedestrian safety, sometimes you feel like you're swimming upstream. We have to remember that the people at the top have a lot of responsibilities, and this is just one of them. But you have to look at the big picture. What is your community trying to promote? If you look at branding versus reality, what are the mission statements? Do you try to sell your department as a world-class transportation system, or a welcoming community, come grow with us, and have all kinds of pictures of happy families with their kids and wagons and strollers and diversity, but in reality you don't have any money set aside for accessibility programs, and you kind of grumble every time you have to do something. So the branding is the mission statements. Realities may be something different. And at some point you have to step back and say, wait, are we walking the walk? Are we just talking? So a lot of people will adopt policies, complete streets policies, or diversity and inclusion policies. And they do it on paper, but they don't follow through. So you see this a lot, and sometimes it takes someone different to come in and shake things up and get a big organization moving in a different direction. And I've found that performance measures really help. So what gets measured gets done. So if someone is held accountable and responsible for completing a certain number of curb ramps or certain miles of sidewalk, or they have $100,000 to spend on X and have to account for what they did with it, that work actually gets done. So setting up performance measures can really make a difference. Slide 47. And a lot of cities and state DOTs will have planning documents, tons and tons of planning documents. You can have a comprehensive plan. Some of these are even required. And you have a comprehensive plan, you have your bike and pedestrian plans, you may have park and rec plan, development plans, transportation plans. States are required to have a STIP, or a statewide transportation improvement plan. Everybody has capital improvement plans. And everyone should have an ADA transition plan if they have more than 50 employees. So we all have these plans, and we spend lots and lots of money on these plans. And I plan to retire someday, but what am I doing about it? So are these plans sitting in a bookshelf, or are they on your desk and well used and well worn and taken into consideration? Slide 48. So we're going to talk a little bit about the ADA transition plans. And we talked about this before, but this is how you can make progress in making your community more accessible. So again, program access, not every facility has to be accessible, but that applies more to buildings than it does to your sidewalks and bus stops and parking, the things we find in the public right-of-way. But you're required to have an evaluation of your program's policies and activities, whether or not, regardless of how many employees you have. There's a lot of guidance out there. So there's an NCHRP report. If you go onto Federal Highway's website and type in transition plan, you will get plenty of information to get you moving in the right direction. An important part is that you identify obstacles to access. So your obstacles are likely to be sidewalks, curb ramps, pedestrian signals, parking, and transit. And that's what we see people having to evaluate, when they look at their public right-of-way. But you also have to take into consideration that you have safe harbor. So you don't have to necessarily fix everything all at one time. Slide number 49. So when we talk about our transition plan, it's required if you have more than 50 members. It covers existing facilities, and everything that needs structural modification needs to be on the plan. So you have to identify physical barriers, and those barriers can be by type or element. They don't necessarily have to be the cross slope or the running slope or the dimension of every curb ramp in your entire system. So you can simplify and take the money that you would be using to go out and measure everything and actually apply it towards making things more accessible. But you have to come up with a methodology to remove the barriers and a schedule to achieve compliance, and you also have to have the person that's responsible for getting the work done. Slide 50. So your methods for barrier removal. So here are some of the most common ones. Your resurfacing projects. If you have a 15 to 20 year cycle for your streets, you're eventually going to hit all your curb ramps. When you look at your capital improvements project, those are good opportunities to remove barriers. Safe routes to school projects can also be used for sidewalks and curb ramp barrier removal. When you have developments and permits and accommodations, and a lot of communities have ADA improvement dedicated funding, and some people have a specific tax dedicated to pedestrian facilities. And when you upgrade your pedestrian facilities, you'll be making them more accessible. And you also have to have a schedule. So all of this work should have been done by 1995. And so all of your cities are really accessible, right? Because that was a very long time ago. Most people have failed in getting this done, and they've continued to build things that are not accessible in the meantime. So set deadlines and set milestones. Again, performance measures and reporting to the public on your website helps you make progress. Slide 51. How do you prioritize? Where do you start? And the ADA gives you a place to start. So their priorities for walkways serving government agencies, so our government facilities like your schools, your parks, your city buildings, your post offices, transportation facilities like your bus stops. Places of public accommodation are your entertainment centers, your hotels, your businesses. Employers, of course, are places where people work, and your other areas tend to be the residential areas. You don't have as many people who are visiting the area or circulating around as you do in your business areas maybe. And you can have a data-driven, where the severity, proximity, and proximity to priority areas really guides your prioritization. But that data can be overwhelming and frequently goes completely unused. Slide 52. So an important part of a transition plan is that you get public input and you have public access to the document. So there was a saying when the Americans with Disabilities Act was being promoted, and it's nothing for us without us. So it's important to include everyone, but especially go out and look for people who have a special interest in what you're doing to get their input. And make sure that's available to the public. So it's a living document. It changes all the time. Every time you fix things, you document it. And you use it for planning, budgeting, and tracking improvements and accessibility. So it's not sitting on the shelf. You know where it is on your desk. It's part of your project planning system. Slide 53. So when we change over, talked about high-level planning, let's talk about project-level planning. Is your project-level planning based on some of those established plans we talked about? Probably it's based on your capital improvements or your STIP, but are you looking at your transition plan? And you need to develop your project scopes with accessibility in mind. Be proactive. Don't try to create loopholes where you're not making accessibility improvements. Look for places where you might extend the project scope so that you capture those opportunities. And coordinating projects and coordinating funding and planning can go a long way in getting the work done. Slide 54. So when you're looking at project scope, you could have a geographical limit from point A to point B You can also have a service or activity related scope. So paving versus signals. If you're running a paver down the street, if you're doing resurfacing and you meet the requirements that DOT and DOJ have explained to us, you may be incorporating your curb ramps. But you may not be having signal people out there. So while your curb ramps get an improvement, your signals may be outside of the scope of the project. And again, look at the curb ramps. If your project scope is curb ramps, do you have to do the sidewalks? That doesn't get pulled in based on the regulations. At some point, the sidewalks need to be reviewed and addressed. Project scope, again, you need to provide, it's an opportunity to address transition plan elements. And you need to provide an opportunity for people to say, you know, this is part of the scope, but is the scope big enough? Or is it too big? Slide 55. And who should attend? Everyone should attend. But you have to sometimes make an effort to find the advocacy groups and the disability working groups. There are lists in a lot of communities where you can find people, the groups that represent people with disabilities. When you have a public meeting, make sure the space is accessible and that parking and pedestrian access is accessible. You have captioners and interpreters. Is it near a transit stop? You know, a lot of people who have disabilities don't necessarily drive. And I find I hate driving in downtown DC, so if there's a meeting, I much prefer to go, or I'm more likely to attend if it's near a transit stop and I can walk from there. But there are a lot of meeting checklists that are available, and if you search for them on the internet, there's way too many to list, but there's some really good ones out there. Slide 56. So what about when we're designing Praxis? Slide 57. Start by reviewing your policies. Are they up to date with current practices? Look at your design standards. Do they reflect accessibility? Even though you don't have a standard for the public right-of-way specifically, your policies, by following your standards and details and policies, you should end up with an accessible facility. Next slide. So we talked before about what policies are you supposed to be following. So the regulations have told us if you're building curb ramps, you have to follow the 2010 ADA standards. But DOT has said there's flexibility in design for areas that are not covered. So we've used this slide over and over. That flexibility can come from whatever engineering or design guidance you can find out there that you feel comfortable provides a high level of access. Slide 59. When you review your policies, so somebody asked me a question and I looked up their standards to see if they were even headed in the right direction. And what I found was the picture on the left. And, you know, it's copied out of a 3-ring notebook. It hasn't been updated since 2002. There's no information on there about slopes. And it's their curb ramp standard detail. And that's the only one they have. Is that what you're working with? Or are you working with something more like what you see on the right, which is detailed? It gives you a lot of different options because we know that one size doesn't fit all with curb ramps. So make sure that you have an inclusive group of standards and they should grow as you encounter additional types of designs. If you see them often enough, they should become part of your standards so people can be consistent and make good decisions on when they're building them. Slide 60. And look at your standard drawings. You know, don't follow just minimum design. You have to look at good design. So the pictures that are here, there's an allowance for up to 5 feet to be in front of the detectable warnings. And if you have a flare next to a 5-foot funky triangle at the bottom, their landing or turning space, you could potentially walk from a perpendicular direction into the street and never encounter the detectable warnings. So good design is more important than minimum design. Slide 61. And temporary routes. Review your traffic control plan. This is something that a lot of people kind of ignore. And public right-of-way guidelines just reference Chapter 6 on the manual and uniform traffic control devices. And that's your Bible for work zones. And it's a good idea for, even if you're doing a temporary route that's not part of a work zone, it gives you good guidance on how you can direct people. Talks about alternate routes and different barricades and channelizers. Slide 62. And again, yellow tape is not a piece of work zone equipment. So when you're designing for construction, so for the construction to come out correctly, you have to design correctly. And your design has to accommodate some of the unknowns that are out in the field. So construction tolerance is allowed where there's conventional industry tolerance, except where dimensions are stated as a range. So minimum and maximum values are ranges. Maximum of 2% cross slope means you can build anything less than 2%. 48-inch minimum width is a range. So anything greater than 48 inches meets that requirement. And you need to build tolerance into the design. So your cross slopes, if you want the final concrete to harden at less than 2%, don't give them a design that says 2% where there's no room for no wiggle room for field things that happen in the field. So one idea is to specify that your cross slope would be 1.5% plus or minus 0.5%. So the contractor is going to build 1.5%, but that gives them 0.5% of wiggle room. And this needs to be built into your designs because it takes extra space. It may take extra length on a curb ramp when you're making it flatter. So it's important in your design to put in the construction tolerances. Slide 63. And local policy. So local policy is to exceed the minimums. Adopt enforceable policies. In general, keep your slopes less steep, your dimensions bigger, and provide clear direction. Don't say meet all the federal requirements or it must be ADA compliant, because that doesn't really give anyone very good direction. 64. And we're going to speed through some of the rest of these. So another best practice is to have a design checklist. Make a checklist that lists all of the requirements you're supposed to meet, and make sure that each of your designs follows the checklist. And you can put the policy expected values. You might also want to note what the minimum level is for access. So your policy and the minimums should be different. And then when you can't make everything accessible because things are technically infeasible quite a bit of the time, slide number 65, we have a design exception. So if you have a design exception process, you can, when things don't meet all of the design requirements, you have a formal method to identify the scope. It's important to identify what the existing conditions are and the limitations, and then compare design alternatives and track what your thought process was. And then every alteration that's done needs to be reevaluated. Slide 66. And approval, you should challenge the exceptions. Get fresh eyes. Talk to a person who has a disability and see what they think of the design. 67. 68. So we're going to talk about construction. Pre-construction meetings are super important. Pre-construction is where you set the tone for your construction project. You need to talk about construction tolerances, how you're going to measure things, inspection checklists, and discuss alternate pedestrian routes during construction, and assign and accept responsibility. 69. So in your pre-construction meeting, it's good to have the contractors and the inspectors together in the room to help build relationships. Talk about construction tolerances. Are there any tolerances? How are you handling Are you making things 2%, 2.0%? And the right answer to that is 2.0%. While there's some flexibility, DOJ and DOT don't really recognize that. How do you measure? 2-foot or 4-foot level? Or it doesn't matter. There's nothing that says how you have to measure. You may find that a 6-inch level works better for smaller spaces. How are your inspectors going to measure? Make sure your contractors know that so that they can inspect their own projects in the same way. Slide 70. And planning your project. Scheduling and phasing is super important. If you have an elementary school and people walk to that school, you don't want to schedule your construction in September. You don't want to take out all the curb ramps at every intersection all at one time. So that's important. Make sure that your public notice includes pedestrian facilities. And yellow tape is not a construction device. Slide 71. And for inspection, it's really important that your staff is trained, your internal inspectors and the contractors, because the contractors and the inspectors should be getting the same answer when they look at a finished project. And some agencies have decided to certify responsible parties so they know that people know what they're doing. You might put together a field guide. There are a lot of them out there if you look on the internet. They can contain the policies, other information, resources like the engineer's number, police, fire, hospital. You know, if you close off a street, even if it's temporarily, it's important that the police and the fire department know they can't go down that street. 72. Walk through your work zone. We're running really short on time, so walk through your work zone and experience the alternate route. That's really important. Use your inspection checklist. It should be very similar to your design checklist. And document field changes. Because once you have given it final approval, you've bought your project. And now it belongs to you. And if it's not right, you're going to pay for it again when you redo it on your transition plan. Slide 73. And make sure you have good documentation and a good tracking method. Keep it in your system somewhere. And make sure you mark things off your transition plan if they're development projects or permit projects. 74, 75. So regular operations, check how things are working. Make sure that they're operating correctly, make sure they're accessible. 76. And maintenance. Keep up with your accessible features. There's a requirement to maintain accessible features. 77. And your maintenance practices. Do you have policies? Do you have equipment? Do you have staff to deal with snow removal, tree trimming? These are all really important in the day-to-day operations and maintenance for people to get around. 78. And permits. Permits are the way that an agency controls their right-of-way, who gets to use it and how they get to use it. So pay attention to outdoor seating and displays. Personal transportation devices are a big deal. Scooters and bike shares are coming in everywhere, and they have to have permits. Permit inspectors can use construction checklists. They should be working on the same page as the construction people. And make sure that you monitor your pedestrian routes and track your ADA improvements. Next slide. So slide number 79 is the resources, the same resources that you have had. The Access Board is great, Federal Highway is great, DOJ is great, and I still haven't gotten that resource handout to the Mid-Atlantic Center. I will do that by tomorrow so they can post it for you. And I apologize for not leaving much time for questions, but I don't know if we have time for any at all. We have time for just a few, don't we?
I think we might have time for one or two. You've just given us so much great information. But we do have a couple of questions. One is about bus stops. They're basically a transit facility, but they're generally within the public right-of-way. So who is responsible for upgrades and making accessibility improvements for bus stops?
So bus stops are tricky because they're on the city right-of-way, but cities don't choose where the stops are, and transit agencies don't really have control over what gets built in the right-of-way. So it's important to have a partnership and some policies set out on who does what when. So there's no specific person or agency. If there's a complaint filed, everybody gets to go to court.
Thanks. I think we have time for another question or two. We have an interesting question here about on-street parking spaces. Can accessible parking spaces be removed if a parking lane is converted to a bike lane?
So that happens a lot in DC. They're taking out parking and putting in bike lanes, and that's a really good question. If you remove parking, you've removed it completely. You removed it for everyone. So what you have to do is go back and count the new number of spaces that are available on the perimeter of your block, like we talked about before, and then now you'll have a new requirement for accessibility. So for the number of accessible spaces. So if they were on the side of the block that now has a bike lane instead of parking, you'll have to find another location for them.
Okay, good answer. We have another question here about if you don't have a sidewalk per se, but people tend to walk along the shoulder next to the road. Does that then become considered a pedestrian route, and should it be included in the transition plan to install a sidewalk or a more accessible type of pedestrian route there?
So a shoulder of a road is just that. It's a shoulder of a road built to support the pavement structure. However, if people walk on it, and there are origin and destination locations, and it's a pretty well-known path of how to get from point A to point B, you need to start thinking about it as a pedestrian route. And should it be on your transition plan? Possibly, probably, maybe even. Building a sidewalk where you know you have a lot of pedestrians, of course, is more ideal because it gets people further away from the traffic. So I guess probably an agency would have to decide on their own if they want to, or how a roadside shoulder really fits into their pedestrian system and their transition plan. If it's part of their pedestrian system, it should be on their transition plan.
That might be one of those good opportunities for for some public input. We have another question here about, could you talk a little bit about floating bus stops and how that could impact people who are trying to cross the street?
So a floating bus stop is something that's come around recently, or at least I'm hearing about them a lot more in the recent past. A floating bus stop is where you have a sidewalk. If you work from the outside of the right-of-way in, you have a sidewalk, and then you have a cycle track or a bike lane. And then outside of that, so they're in the street, more in the street area, you have a raised area or even a street level stop for the buses. And the problem with that people are really struggling with is if you have a transit shelter, how do you get from that shelter over to where the bus boarding and alighting area is? And the path seems simple if you can see where you're going and what's going on around you. But for a person with a vision impairment or who is blind, it becomes a lot more difficult because bikes, you know, a person who doesn't see is much more dependent on what they hear, and bikes don't really make any noise. And they don't always yield to pedestrians like they should. And so it makes people with vision impairments really uncomfortable as they walk down a curb ramp and have to cross a bike lane to get to the boarding and lighting area for a bus stop. And there are a lot of innovative designs that are coming out. If you look in Federal Highway has put out a new guidebook on cycle tracks, and it has a lot of good ideas. City of Los Angeles, I believe, is working on a good policy. And if you have a consultant who's familiar with good urban design, and you're in an area that has bus rapid transit, for example, you can come across some really good designs. So you'll probably have to reach out if you're not familiar with them, and suddenly you find yourself building them.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We are coming up on the bottom of the hour. I think we are going to have to wind things up here. We want to make sure that we give folks the code for their AIA units or certificates of participation. The code for the day is PUBLIC, the word public as in public right-of-way. Please consult the reminder email that you received about this session for instructions on how to obtain your certificate or your credits for this session. Please email the code above, public, to adatraining@transcend.org by 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, June 17th, this next coming Monday. And as we wind up, we want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we most especially want to thank Melissa Anderson for all of the information, expertise that she has shared with us today and throughout this series of webinars. It has just been tremendously informative, and we really appreciate Melissa taking her time and sharing her expertise with us. And again, if you have any additional questions about our services here at the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, your certificates or units for this session, or anything else about the ADA, please feel free to contact us. You can reach us on our toll-free telephone line at 800-949-4232 if you're here in the Mid-Atlantic region. If you're not, you will get a hold of one of our sister ADA centers located around the country. So again, thank you one and all for joining us. Thanks to Melissa for presenting for us, and enjoy the rest of your day.